Hi everyone and welcome to week 8. This week we're going to be talking about sexuality and sexual orientation. And when we're doing so, we're oftentimes just talking about romance and then building a relationship that starts on that or not. And then how that is going to affect the remainder of one's life. That is your workplace, your work-life balance, the way you allocate your time at home, what you do with yourself, how you'll have relationships with your family of origin and how those will be impacted by and will impact your romantic relationship. So as we go into this, try and start thinking about what factors shape wanting to be in a relationship or not wanting to be in a relationship. What is it? What are those elements? So identify those within yourself, whether you're coupled or whether you're single, whether you're divorced, whether you're married, go for it. Oftentimes when we select a partner or we fail to select a partner when you don't want to be in a romantic relationship, there's more to it that's going on than just your individualistic desires or who you are as a person. A lot of it is dependent upon sociocultural factors. And one of the most important things is what are the expectations and cultural understandings about relationships? Are people of your age expected to be in permanent relationships or to play the field or in no relationships at all? How your religion, where you live, the level of education you want to attain, and your finances, all of these things help to shape when you think it's normal and with whom you think it's normal to engage in a relationship with. Oftentimes in the United States, we have a lot of homogeneity, that is, sameness amongst relational partners, amongst romantic relationship partners, that we have the same type of age, the same type of height, the same type of education, the same type of religiosity, even if you're not a member of the same religion, that if one person is religious, the other is likely to be too, and the vice versa is also true. The same type of approach to finances, more or less, and being from the same type of social and economic class background. Why is this the case? Well, it really is affected by who you run into, who you are able to select as a partner. If you are going to college, you're more likely to run into fellow college students. And those people are likely to be in your same age bracket, and they're likely to live in your same geographic area. So all of those are sociocultural factors. We also have things like your personal desires. If you're the kind of person, regardless of the surroundings you find yourself in, that wants to be in a relationship, with socialization and what you were taught about relationships, if they were seen as appealing or not, and how to treat someone in a relationship, and who would be a good partner, and stigma. That is there stigma associated with your sexuality, your sexual orientation, or whom you might choose as a partner? Having a stigmatized identity means having an identity that other people view as wrong or deviant or somehow abnormal. Oftentimes, when we talk about stigma, we talk about other people's reactions to one's stigmatized identity. That other people's reactions towards you might spoil the idea that you have a normal identity. And stigma in this way can be seen in two variants. It's discredited, that is, everyone knows you have this stigma, and you are widely known as someone who has an abnormal identity, or it's discreditable. That is, if it's discovered or found out, you will be stigmatized. And stigma can be anticipated, it can be internalized, and it can be enacted. You can act in stigmatized ways. You can act as a stigmatized person. With discredited and discreditable, we could apply this to sexual orientation, especially if you think back into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., with homosexuality. If one was known to be homosexual at a time and in a dominant society that was homophobic, that would be a discredited identity. If one was not known but could be found out, that would be discreditable. Now, one of the things that we think about when we talk about stigmatized identity is that why would somebody have that? Why would somebody choose to be a stigmatized sexual identity when one could instead be a member of the dominant sexual orientation groups? Now, Patricia Hill Collins indicates in her writings that the actual existence of laws and regulations demonstrates that heterosexual marriage is not such a phenomenon, but rather through the regulation of it, through trying to put people into that category, it demonstrates that it is not necessarily a natural and normal occurrence. She says that if it was such a natural normal thing, and if it occurred naturally within racial groups as well, that is, not having interracial marriage, we would not have to regulate marriage. We wouldn't have to have laws saying you can't marry that person, you have to marry this person. So laws and cultural customs exist then to discipline the population, to force the population into accepting the status quo. And if those people don't accept the status quo, then they're more likely to be seen as stigmatized. And a stigma then functions to behaviorally and morally differentiate those who are supposedly good from those who are supposedly bad. So in this article with Hannah Blank's Straight article, she's talking about the experience that she's had of being labeled straight regardless of having a male partner who has, or male appearing partner who has Klinefelter syndrome, which is a chromosomal makeup including the additional X chromosome. So having more variation than we would typically think about with our sex binary in the United States and in the 21st century. So here what we have is a role of genetics and biology being used to define what's male and female in non-binary terms. And our sexuality definitions are usually based upon these really traditional assumptions of heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual. But she helps to complicate this in the article by the fact that heterosexual and homosexual are terms of a relatively recent origin and are tied really more closely to legal issues than anything related to personal perception or identity. And now I'd like you to flip to the next slide and think about, go to the paragraphs I'm indicating on page 241 and think about what it means that heterosexual becomes the idea of a success. This is an image from the vows column of the New York Times, and this is what we see as a very normal looking wedding. The more we validate something as normal, in this case it's heterosexual and it's white, the more we need something to be abnormal to give the behavior meaning. So what would we see as abnormal sexuality? Well, according to Hill Collins, it would be both homosexual and it would be including people of color. So here we have one type of variation. It's homosexuality, but it's much of mostly white people. And it looks pretty upper class. It looks pretty married. It looks pretty white. It looks as close to the straight ideal as is possible. So this gets less stigmatized. But let's see something that's a little bit more stigmatized. Well, these people, another from the New York Times vows column, it is a male couple. They are a non-white couple, but they are definitely a wealthy couple. And the wealth seems to signify in the celebration, in the largeness of the celebration, in the beauty of the wedding, it seems to signify the lack of stigma associated with this couple. However, within their wedding website, there were quotes from the guests that indicated that the love between the two men in the previous slide was somehow not 100% considered normal. They had to qualify it, even in their celebration of it, in their validation of it. It says that love is important. It's a human condition. That love looks different on all of us, but on these two husbands, it looks beautiful. In having to say that, in having to remark that their love is valid, it still is indicating that many people would say that it is a secondary status relationship. It's not as significant and normative as it would be between people who were straight. And for those who are people of color and who are homosexual or bisexual and who are not middle class or upper class, they're oftentimes portrayed in popular culture as quite abnormal, as unconventional. So when thinking about popular culture images, these are the two that come to mind from Orange is the New Black, that the African American woman is portrayed as pretty crazy, and from The Wire, where the character is a someone who robs drug dealers, and he is portrayed as quite deviant. Within Patricia Hill Collins' very important book called Black Sexual Politics, she talks about the images and cultural images about African American women, how they are oftentimes problematic, that they are oftentimes seen through a melange of images that suggest animalisticness, of focus on the booty or the bottom, and focus on sexually explicit lyrics, and that this oftentimes becomes the sum total of how African American women are portrayed and understood in popular culture representations. For this, she draws on the history of Sarah Baartman, and there's a link on the next slide to a YouTube video about the history of Sarah Baartman, who was a woman from Africa who was taken as a slave to Europe, and then she was displayed in museums because of the size of her bottom, and she was forced to stand naked, and then she was forced to become a prostitute, and then she died at quite a young age. And then, really horrifically, that her body parts were still placed on display in the museum over 100 years after she passed away, because she was seen not as a person, but as a sexual object, as someone to be viewed, as someone to be seen as a thing. So somewhat similar to Sarah Baartman is the case of Josephine Baker. They're totally dissimilar in their outcomes. They're dissimilar in their choices and their power, but they're both similar in that their bodies have been gazed upon. Their bodies have been viewed. That they exist for the titillation at times of others. So Josephine Baker was a singer and a performer in the 1920s. She went to Europe and lived in France for a long time and enjoyed freedoms there that were not allowed in the Jim Crow era of the United States. but she oftentimes danced in a banana skirt. And think back to Sarah Bartman and connect that. The banana skirt saying that she was not quite a person, but perhaps she was more of someone who lived in the jungle. Perhaps someone who would eat bananas, or the kind of animal that would eat bananas. Really objectifying a person in this way. And it's not to say that she did not have power and grace and talent, but that she had to, in order to be successful at that time period, use that kind of animalistic and jungle imagery in order to promote herself as a performer. So she was trapped in kind of a racist images and had to use those in order to be successful. And this is, I believe, from 2009, and this is Beyonce, who's using the same type of outfit. And she's paying homage to Josephine Baker, but is she also considering the idea of Sarah Bartman? Is she also considering the history of why women had to wear this kind of outfit? This is problematized by Patricia Hill Collins when she's thinking about the types of presentations of African American women and the limited array of presentations that are allowed to be seen within the media, that there are only few types of images and they're not expansive enough that could go beyond things such as worship of the booty, such as the embrace just of bodies, just all of this sexualization that women are primarily seen in that way. She problematizes that. Read also the lyrics on the next page. Now, it's one thing when Beyonce is singing this, and she's very talented and has a wonderful voice, but it's another, Patricia Hill Collins is suggesting, if it's a teenager who says this, and it's a teenager or a young girl or a young boy who defines the African American body in the same way. I think this is an absolutely fascinating quote, that contemporary forms of oppression do not routinely force people to submit, right? They don't force us to do things. Instead, they manufacture consent for domination so that we lose our ability to question and thus collude in our own subordination. What does Patricia Hill Collins mean when she's saying this? She's saying we're not forced to dress or act or engage in certain ways, but we do so. And in doing so, we are often acting more in ways that sometimes can reinforce one's own subordinate status. And yes, it can be lovely and wonderful for people to utilize sexual agency. But is it possible for people to do so in ways that do not reinforce their oppression or reinforce their objectification? And that's really kind of an open-ended question. And we've been talking about the history of Sarah Bartman and how that plays into more contemporary visions with Josephine Baker and then Beyonce. But this certainly applies to other ethnic groups as well. It's certainly not just about African women or African American women. The next two slides just demonstrate other ways that the Caucasian women and Latin women might be encouraged to see themselves also in more sexualized ways. With cardio striptease classes, for instance, that were popular about 5 years ago, and would say that you can boost your self-confidence through seeing yourself as more of a sexualized object. So it really becomes quite a conundrum. How can one have sexual agency and sexual voice without concurrently being seen as a sexual object or reinforcing the oppression of themselves and other women?